How are you today?
Oh, good. Thank you, Donovan. Very well. Very well.
That's good. Well, thank you for making the time to come today. I know you're a busy man.
Well, I think we're both busy, Donovan, which has been reflected in the number of phone calls it took to be able to catch each other. But
yes,
no, this is important what we're talking about. So there's always time for this.
Oh, good. Thank you very much. And so just for our listeners, David, do you want to just talk a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. I'm a family lawyer. All I do is family law, and all of the firm that I work with does family law. As part of my work, I do work as an independent children's lawyer. So they're lawyers that are appointed through the court system, in particular cases where the court thinks that it may be useful to have someone who actually represents the children. So I work in private practice, but there's also ICLs or independent children's lawyers that work through VLA. So what will happen is they'll have a particular case. I will be contacted and asked if I'm available to be involved to act on behalf of the child or children in those proceedings. So it's funded separately from the parents. It's separate from the parents. And the aim is to make sure that the best interests of the children are represented before the court.
Okay. I mean, that's really interesting because when we often hear about a separation and divorce, we often hear from the parents. We don't often hear the voice of the children. I know in university, I learned about this child focus and child inclusive process in court system. But do you mind telling us what it is involved when the children, and when you become a lawyer for the child?
Okay, well, first I'll just talk about the process that I do is that once I get an appointment, I'll write to both parties and or both parents, and I'll actually invite them to contact me. And in the past I would have met with them, but now I do it by Zoom or telephone. I sort of have a view that if someone's going to represent my child, I'd want to know who they are and what they're going to do.
Yes,
so it gives me a chance to speak with them and understand what I do. And my job is to represent best interests. And perhaps just as an example of it, is if I was acting for you, Donovan, I would speak with you, I'd give you advice, and you'd give me instructions as to what to do.
Okay.
The distinction would be, and perhaps if I give you an example, I met with a little girl, she was age 7, and she lived with her dad. And when I met with her, she said to me, I never want to see my mum again.
Okay.
Now, if I was acting on her instructions, I would have gone to court and said that's what she said. But because I represented her best interests, I went to court and said to the judge, this is what she said to me, but for her, I think this is what should happen. Okay, in other words, that she did need to be able to spend time with her mother. And it comes back to a basic concept that children have rights and parents have responsibilities, and they shouldn't be confused. And there are decisions that children get to make, and there are others they don't get to make.
Yes.
And important decisions regarding children remain with parents. And if they can't make them, someone called a judge will assist them to make that decision. But you know, your 8-year-old doesn't get to come home and say, well, you know, I've decided I'm not going to school anymore because I'm old enough to make that decision. And because you and dad have separated, you know, I'm now empowered. It just doesn't happen like that.
Yeah.
And so once I've spoken with the parents, I'll then meet with the child. And I think that's really important. And perhaps one of the key messages I say to a child is, you don't get to decide this. You are not responsible for what are mum and dad's or parents' decisions. And I will work with mum and dad to try and make a decision. And if we can't, then someone called a judge will help them.
Okay.
But I think that's really important. That's the distinction. Children are not responsible for important decisions about their welfare.
Okay, fair enough, because that's a good point, because often when we think about you know, law and children and family, is that it's very you know, who's right and what's wrong and who makes the decision. But in this case, the children do have a voice about what they think, what they feel should happen in their case. But ultimately, you're saying the decision still lies in the system, the court system.
Well, it does. And of course, it depends on the age of a child. It's similar as children are involved in decisions within a family according to their age. You know, a 7-year-old can come home and say, I would like to go and play at a friend's place this weekend. Now, that's clearly a very different discussion that you have. And you can talk about that, and they're actively involved in the decision making. but they don't get to decide whether they're going to the dentist.
Okay, that's really interesting because I mentioned to you before that I'm writing a book and talking about children. And one of the chapter that I'm writing is that I talk about how in family have structures, and when you're still young, most decisions are made by parents, but you include the children in discussion. You know, it's what we call the child inclusive parenting style. But obviously, when children are young, I see this in play therapy. One child will be playing with the army, you know, the figure, and say, die, 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 mommy die. And so when you have this conversation and say, well, what does it mean that mommy's died? It doesn't mean mommy's died forever. It's just died at that very moment. Yes. And I think you made a very good point there when you say, I don't want to see mom now. I think at that very moment, she may not want to see mom. And if we take that as a gospel, then you basically isolating one parent. Did I understand that right?
Yeah, it is. And that actually could be her true belief. Now, I don't know why she said that to me, and I'm not qualified to do that. You are. You'd be qualified to be able to have that discussion with a child. But what I represent is her best interests. And the best interest in that case is that she got to know who her mum was. I think that was really important. But when you think about it, she could have said it because she believed it. That's what she thought her dad wanted to say. She thought that was the right thing to say. She might have thought I wanted to hear it. I mean, you would know better than me all the different reasons why a child might say it. Child's not lying.
No.
They're just, that's what they've said to me.
Yeah.
But again, there's a bigger decision to be made, and that's what parents have to make. And as I say, if they can't make them, that's when they get assisted by someone called a judge.
Yeah, that's interesting because, you know, when I think about independent children's lawyer, I'm thinking that the child would just go in and say, I want this, and this is going to happen. And it's obviously, that's not how the system works. You still have to have both voices.
Well, look, the voice of the child will be heard in part through me.
Yeah.
In part, it will be heard through the parents.
Yeah.
Okay. Through their filing of material of the court. And in part, it'll be heard through things called like a family report, which is a report where someone like a child psychologist, child counselor, speaks with the parties, speaks with the children, and gets some sense of what's happening. But I keep coming back. It's really important that the child understands that they don't get to make the decision in this matter. And you need to remove responsibility off them because, of course, if dad says, oh, do you want to spend more time with me? Of course. The same question by mum? Of course. But both parents are getting exactly the same answer, but when they repeat it to the other parent because there isn't that good communication, it's taken in a different way.
That's what I was going to say, because we often hear this when I'm working with families and children in a family therapy setting. I would always, I would never put them all in the same room at the same time. In the beginning, I would speak to the child first, spend half an hour. If I feel that it's safe to bring mom or dad, I'll bring one of the parents. If it's not safe, then they have to wait in the waiting room. I would continue with the child. And often, and I hear this, the child one day would say, I don't want to go home to dad. And, you know, when you say, okay, well, tell me what's going on. It could be the smallest thing. Dad did not let the child play video games. So now the child is upset and don't want to be with dad because mom allows the video games to continue even at midnight. So there's a power play happening. Do you get to hear this side?
I do, but what I try to do is, because one of the advantages of meeting with parents is that you can try and put things a little bit in context. And I'll always say to parents, use the terms we, us, and our. What we need to do for our child.
Yes. Okay.
Not what I want, not do you want. In other words, you're both working together.
Yeah.
So I always try and pick up on that with them.
Yes, because it's what I've seen as well. And, you know, depending on how confrontational it is as well, I would, like I said, I work with, I'll give you an example. And if I had known you back then, I probably would have said to her, maybe go and see an independent lawyer. I was working with a 15-year-old, and one of the issue is that she was violent towards parents and children, siblings. And so I was working for community services at that time. I was doing some locum work, and so I ended up working with the family. And what I found later on is that it was more about her frustration. She doesn't feel like she was being heard in the family. And so she was acting out.
Yeah.
And imagine if that has gone to court, just saying, I want out of my parents' house. I don't know what scenario that would look like. I was just wondering.
Yeah, and look, and by the time you're getting to 15, 16, and 17, I mean, you're almost at an age where children can vote with their feet. And so you need to be very careful about that, because just because you tell a child who's 15 what they're going to do, doesn't necessarily they're going to do it. If you remember, court orders bind parents, they don't bind children.
Yes, I learned that in working for the child support many years ago, and I seem to be going in and out of the family unit, child protection, child support, drug court, but I always end up in family, and this is why families it still interests me and to this day. And it's good to actually hear that because I often hear about children's court and children's independent lawyer, but I don't actually know what you guys actually do.
Okay, well, perhaps if I just, hopefully I can explain it in a way that's clear.
Yes.
It comes back to the way our federation, and we have states and Commonwealth. States originally had all the power regarding children. To set up the Commonwealth, to set up the federal government, they allocated some powers to the federal government, but they also kept some.
Okay.
And so the ones that they gave to the government enabled them to set up ultimately the family court in 1975. All right. What they did is the state retained some of the protection powers that it had, which is what DHHS does.
Okay.
So it's one of the reasons why our Murray River system arguably doesn't work well, because it's a combination of states and the federal government trying to balance up their different rights. So therefore, if it's a protection issue, it goes to the children's court. And if it's to do with between parents and otherwise and arrangements, it goes to the family court or the federal circuit court. But of course, you get a crossover. And so what will happen is that if there are proceedings in the children's court, in other words, protection involving DHHS, nothing can happen in the federal court because state laws take precedence over federal in those circumstances.
Okay.
So that's why you don't have them running at the same time. And that also explains why sometimes when you've got a matter in the family court, DHHS will say, we're not going to become involved because we feel that the matter is already before the court and we won't become involved. If they did issue an application, it would suspend everything in the family court because the state court takes precedence. So, and you may have actually seen in Western Australia the difference because, and it's really surprising in other countries, a lot of countries have it combined. So that the one court deals with all children's matters, we don't. And it's due to the fact of the way our states and our federal government is set up.
Okay. Well, that makes a lot of sense because, you know, when I was studying, I'm getting confused. I'm learning about the Family Act of 1975, but then I also have to learn the Child Protection, Child Youth and Intervention Act of 2005, I think, or something like that. I can't remember. And I'm getting confused. So which one comes first? And and argue, well, depending on which, sometimes, I mean, obviously if it's in the state court, that's where it is. But of course, it makes a lot more sense when you look at it in jurisdictions where the children are dealt with all in the same court. Because you would have seen that, you know, DHHS have access to resources which the family court doesn't always have. Yes.
And of course, what we're dealing with is not necessarily a legal issue. Well, it isn't a legal issue. It's a family issue. That's a social issue.
Is there a sharing of information?
Yeah, there is.
Between state and federal?
Yes, there is. And they've done very well working on a protocol to be able to make sure that information that DHHS has
Yeah.
If they've been involved, is available to the family court and vice versa. So there's a much greater awareness between the two of them. Now, so that's, yeah, so it's much better. Yeah, no, they work very hard on that. Now, Donovan, is that me making a noise on the system, or is that you? Because I'm just wondering if there's anything I need to do.
No, that's not me. It must be you.
Oh dear, all right, well, I'm just going to quit out of everything and hopefully not you then, because I'm just going to make sure it's not me.
No,
okay.
That's not a... So,
sorry about it.
So I guess the other thing that I want to find out, and also probably the viewers, I mean, the listeners want to know, is that what if the child says, I don't want to live with either parents? What do you do then?
Yeah, look, it's again, it's going to come, I guess a typical legal answer, it depends. But clearly you need to look at what the age of the child and what the issues are. I think with your 15-year-old, where there are significant issues in terms of being a risk maybe to siblings and literally saying, I'm not going to be here and going, it's very difficult because the family court of itself can't introduce a third party. It can only resolve a dispute between the parties that are before it.
Okay.
So they can't bring in like a foster parent, for example, for want of a better term. Okay. Now, DHHS can, they have those opportunities if there's orders in the children's court. But of course, by the time you get into 15, 16, it's a really difficult age.
Yes.
I guess as contrasted, if you have a 5-year-old who says, well, I'm not going to be, I don't want to live with mum or dad, you need to be looking at the circumstances of whether mum and dad have the capacity to properly look after. And again, sometimes decisions just have to be made. I'm obviously not going to place the child at risk, but you can see there's going to be very different considerations, whether they're 5 or 15.
Fair enough. So everything that I've been watching in LA law and New York law is...
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
It's nothing to do, it's not like that at all when it comes to the Australian law system.
No, it is a different system. Other than both systems try to focus on the needs of the child, but a court system of itself is adversarial. Okay,
because you know sometimes I watch LA law and here comes the grandmother and saying, no, I want the child because neither parents are capable of looking after the children. So in Australia, that doesn't happen.
Well, no, they certainly they could become a party to the proceedings. Absolutely, yeah. But a court doesn't have the ability. So the family court doesn't have the ability to impose that on a third party that's not part of the proceedings. But no, quite often grandparents do become involved or extended family members. And can I just say that so often they are magnificent with what they take on and the responsibilities that they do to look after their grandchildren. And it might be as simple as being available for a parent and providing support. You know, as an ICL, I will always find out who the grandparents are and where they sit. They are just such a tremendous resource to their children and their grandchildren. They really are wonderful people.
You know what? That really is very important thing that needs to be said out there, because I've supported many grandparents who wants to where the children end up in the grandparents because neither parents could look after the children, and they do such a great job. You know, I've supported a family where the grandma was 63 years old and 4 grandkids in her care, and it's, you know, and I still talk to her now, even though she's no longer one of my clients. You know, I still visit and see how the kids, you know, and it's interesting to see how these grandparents will fight for these children's. And I think you just said something there that it's really important. We need to let our listeners know that, you know, there are many grandparents that are doing such a great job.
Yeah. And they are focused on their children. And so long as they act as grandparents and not parents, then they can maintain a relationship with the other parent as well. And that's really important too. So often you can see that grandparents are the ones that can provide the bridge of communication.
Oh, good. So if I have any clients saying to me, I want an independent children's lawyer, how do they go about finding one?
Well,
do I just give them your name?
No, well, first of all, you need. I get appointed once there's court proceedings.
Okay.
So my view is that generally you should try and keep lawyers as far away from your children as possible. So, all right. So therefore, if they want their child represented in proceedings, then they can ask the court to appoint an independent children's lawyer. There's a criteria that the court has, and it won't surprise you. It obviously involves, maybe some issues of abuse, emotional abuse, family violence,
yes,
drugs, mental health issues. They're the sorts of matters that I become involved in,
okay.
where there are significant concerns. Or they might be litigants in person, and they find it extraordinarily difficult being in the court system and trying to navigate that and resolve matters. So that's how I would be involved. Very limited circumstances, a lawyer can be appointed on behalf of a child, but that's a very, very limited circumstances that occurs. So the majority of times, if you were not in the court system, then you wouldn't have a lawyer representing the children. And, I'd be working hard to make sure that parents meet with someone like yourself and work things out. There's nothing in the Family Law Act that helps you parent your children.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah.
All the Family Law Act tells you is how a third party called a judge, someone who doesn't know your child, will do their best to make a decision based on information that is put before them.
Yeah.
And that's really what it is.
And as you mentioned, when lawyers are involved, there's the my client is correct, my client is correct, and then the judge have to weigh all the evidence and who's telling the truth, and everyone's truth is different, obviously.
No, that's exactly right. And you never will get two parents coming out of a court case saying, I got everything I wanted.
So there are really no winners in the end.
No, there's not. Court proceedings are very stressful. They're very expensive. And, there are better ways, if parents can, to spend their money on their children than going to court.
That's a good point. And I think that's one of the things that I try to tell my parents that I'm working with is that, is there a better way that you guys can work this out, excluding the court? Because first one, money. Lots of money will be wasted. I say wasted on court system. And two, it doesn't happen overnight. It could take years. I've known a friend of mine who is also a family lawyer up in Queensland. She said she had one case she took over. She had it for 3 years before it was finalized. And so you got money and time being spent when you could spend all of that on your own children. Yes. And work out the difference between you and your ex-partner, because you once loved each other. Now it's not working out, but let's not, make it difficult for the children. Yeah. Well, I will say to parents when I meet with them, how would you like your child, when they turn 21, to reflect on you and the other parent? Would you like them to be able to say, it was a bit difficult, but, they did a really good job? Or do you want them in 15 years' time to say, they're still fighting, they still don't talk to each other? And the reality is that even if parents don't talk to each other, that is a form of communication which is very clear to their children. And indeed, with parents, I quite often say, I don't know the correct term, and you might know a better one. I don't think parents separate. What they do is they change the nature of their relationship. Yes. Because they are still parents, and that hasn't changed at all. And they will have a person called their child who is part of both of them and will see that way. And any criticism of one parent, a child may take that on and see that that's criticism of part of them. I met with one little fella, and he was 8, and he said to me, the only reason mum and dad fight is because of me. It's my fault. Yes, and that's really disheartening when you hear that from children. Yeah. And so now the repair happened. This is where a lot of repair work needs to happen. And thank you for bringing that up, because one of the things I also want parents to realize is that they need to do a lot of repair work with their children, together and separately, because often children will take on things that is not part of their responsibility, taken on their parents. And and one of the things that I also see is that the child will act differently with mom and act differently with dad, which is something you brought up as well. And so when they go to school, they explode because they kept all these emotions inside. You know, they have to act one way with dad, one way with mom. So when they come to school, they explode. It becomes problematic, and the school now don't know how to handle it. And then they say, oh, then accusations fly in and say, is there abuse at home? And then child protection gets involved because the story gets blown out of proportion. And I've seen this happen as a family counselor, you know. And I said, well, how did we get here?
Yeah, and look, there's certainly some cases that have to go before the court. There's no doubt about that. But so many are about the communication and trying to make sure that works well for the parents. It's crucial. It really is, Donna. And you would see that. And I, as an ICL, will see the progression of a case when I look at the court documents, from letters going backwards and forwards about a particular issue, to then issuing proceedings, to then polarising even further. And then what everyone's focusing on is all the interim issues without actually focusing on how that's impacting on the child. It's not a question of, in some ways, it's not a question of who's at fault. It's recognised that everyone's responsible.
I think that's the key, finding out we're all responsible. Any last words, David, for any of the listeners who are thinking about, because I hear this all the time when I'm mediating for parents, is that, the court will just appoint an independent lawyer. And I'm like, oh, let's not wait until that happens. Let's work out what we can do here now. We're in mediation now. What can we do? So any last words or advice to parents?
Yeah, look, the things that your children need, whether they're living in the house with both parents or in separate houses, certainty, stability, security, and routine. That's what they need. If you go to court, you will get a final order. But all that order means the proceedings are finalised. You still then have to work with the other parent, and you have to be able to have some form of communication. But I'd always reflect, how do you want your child to describe the relationship between the parents now? And how do they describe it? How would they describe it? If I was happen to meet with a child, would they say, how do mum and dad get on? And how would you like them to be able to describe it?
I think that's a great advice, David. And I like the fact that you're doing a lot of reflection. You sure you don't want to become a social worker later on?
I sometimes wonder, though, whether every family lawyer needs to go through a good separation themselves to be able to understand exactly what's involved and what it means. Because
yes, because I mean, I've spoken to a few lawyers, but you certainly talk a lot about reflection, and I'm thinking about I'm sure David is not a social worker, but he's reflecting a lot.
Yeah, well, it doesn't always help. My daughter was very surprised that I could do work as an independent children's lawyer. She didn't think I was appropriately qualified, so.
Oh, there you go.
So there you are.
Well, David, thank you very much for your time. Look, I hope that we can speak again next time about a different topic, but this is really good for a lot of parents, and especially parents that I deal with, and saying to me, I'll just get an independent children's lawyer. And I'm like, I don't even know how you get one of them. I know 2 lawyers so far that are children's lawyer, but now that you clarify that, then I think that might give them a better idea that it doesn't happen like that. They really need to work with each other. And the things that you talked about, communication is the key. And that's one of the things that we really need to tell our parents. They need to communicate. Even if they're no longer together, they need to communicate. And the communication must be about the children and the welfare of the children, not about, oh, you did this to me and did that to me.
Yeah, and we could have a talk about that, because there are different ways to do it. Even when you have lawyers involved, lawyers are just a different way of communicating.
Yeah.
In some ways. That's part of our job, is to communicate by way of phone calls and letters. So again, if parents can do that themselves, apart from saving money, there's a better chance that it's going to give a much better outcome for your children.
Actually, you made a very good point there. I never thought of it as lawyers as being a form of communication. So it's like you're a conduit, you know, another form of communication. Except, yes, you said it's adversarial.
Well, it is, and also that's why lawyers, and particularly, it's not just the information that's flowed. You know, there'll be letters. We are disappointed. We are outraged that your client has done this. There can be a whole lot of other emotive language that goes into correspondence, which should not be there, in my view.
Oh, I didn't realize that there is emotive language involved as well.
Well, there is. I think perhaps just to round it off, my view is that when family lawyers work with a family, which they do, I appreciate they represent a client, but they work with a family because they impact on it. That family should be no worse when they finish working with their client than when they began with it.
That's very good advice. Thank you very much for that, David.
Thanks very much, Donovan.
You have a good day.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.